So the Zera Shimshon for Parshas Shemos, if you turn to page Tuf Pei Base, please. Tuf Pei Base. In Tuf Pei Base, the Zera Shimshon quotes the Medrash Yalkut. V'hinei hasneh boer ba'esh. Behold, this thorn bush is burning in fire. Why a thorn bush? So you've heard the explanation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also in exile, but this Medrash offers another explanation. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, al yidei sina shesanu echav liYosef, because of the hatred that the brothers showed Yosef, yardu leMitzrayim, they went down to Egypt. Bishvilo ani nigla besneh, and that's why Hashem appears in the sneh related to the word sinah for hatred, that the sneh was telling Moshe why the Jewish people were originally in exile. That was because of the hatred of Yosef's brothers to him.
Is a sneh a generic name for bush, or it's specifically a thorn bush?
No, it's a thorn bush. Yeah.
So, because the root word, I'm wondering whether it's because you hate to be hit by a thorn.
Yeah, because of the fact that it pokes you. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. But ve'agaelosam, and I will redeem them. Shenemar, and this Medrash quotes this verse. Ga'alta bizroa amecha, you redeemed with your arm, with your strong arm, your nation. Bnei Yaakov v'Yosef, the children of Yaakov and the children of Yosef, Sela always. Adkan l'shono, that's the language of the Midrash.
I'm sorry, where are we? Right.
Page Tuf Pei Base.
Tuf Pei Base.
Right there. Okay.
Thank you.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have a question. The children of Israel going down to Egypt was preordained because it was given as a prophecy to Abraham.
Right.
So why did he have to say that the sin of the hatred of the coming down there if it was already predetermined that they were somehow going to go down to Egypt?
Right. So this is an interesting question that he actually addresses throughout this Parshas Shemos, and he tries to figure out how do you make different explanations for why we're in exile work out altogether. And it's a difficult problem to try to make them all fit together, but it does work. You just have to understand that even when one thing would happen, let's say, for example, Abraham said, Bama Eda, how will I know? So even there, that was only that now if the Jewish people can't do something greater, then that will have to happen. But it still doesn't guarantee. And so all the reasons for why they went down to Egypt have to come together to make it happen. It seems to be the approach that he takes through this parasha.
But the psukim by Abraham they're not equivocal. They're firm. This is what's going to happen. That
something is going to happen. But what is going to happen is not clear at all, especially if you take a closer look. I mean, if you just look at the translation, the translations will say, your children will be slaves, strangers in a strange land. But if you look at the Hebrew, it's actually, the grammar is so complex on that verse because everything is written backwards that you could read that verse at least 10 different ways. And the choice of how that verse should be read was only figured out afterwards. So I'll just give you one example. Will they be slaves for 400 years? We know the Jews weren't slaves for 400 years, but it doesn't say they'll be slaves for 400 years. It says your descendants will be strangers in a strange land, and they will be enslaved, and they will suffer for 400 years. What's the 400 years going on? So most people read it as being enslaved, but that wasn't right. It meant they will be strangers in a strange land, and within that process there'll be enslavement, within that process there'll be suffering. The whole process in total will be a total of 400 years. And that's why it starts counting from Yitzchak's birth. So even that verse is itself difficult to read. Okay. So he says, I'd like to try to understand the connection. What's the connection between the thorn bush and the sale of the brothers of Yosef? But also, why does this Medrash finish with this verse? Ga'alta bizroa amecha, you redeemed with your strong arm, your nation, shenigalu b'zechus Yosef, as if that verse is meant to say that they were saved because of Yosef. B'nei Yaakov v'Yosef Sela. The verse actually states the children of Yaakov and Yosef always. That sounds like all the brothers were doing the right thing in order for the Jews to be redeemed in their merit, because it says the sons of Yaakov and Yosef. Because if the verse would just say, you redeemed them because of Yosef, then I would say, that means the brothers sinned, and Yosef remained holy, and therefore they were saved because of Yosef. But you're blaming the brothers for the exile because they hated Yosef, and then the verse states, you redeemed them through the sons of Yaakov and Yosef.
Why bother saying Yosef?
Why bother saying Yosef separately, right? Furthermore, how is this connected to this burning bush? How is that related as to why they were redeemed? V'yesh lomar, so I'd like to suggest like this. The kavanas ha-medrash ilataris. This medrash is trying to explain. Lama davka nigla kadosh baruch hu lemoshe b'sneh v'lo b'makom acher. Why does Hashem appear to Moshe in a thorn bush and not in any other place? That's clearly the point that the medrash is trying to address. So first the Medrash goes straight into the answer. The hasneh hu lashon sinah. That the word sinah is related to the word sinah, which means hatred, and therefore the message to Moshe was that because the Jews did not get along, because the sons of Yaakov did not get along, that's why they are in this predicament. So he explains, takes it further. Shekashem shegalos Mitzrayim ba ba'avon mechiras Yosef. Because just like the beginning of the exile begins with the sale of Yosef, Kamoshikasav Baal Megala Amukos, as it says in the Megala Amukos, the Lefisha Ashvatim Garmu Laviam Lis Abel Chav Beis Shanim, because they caused their father to suffer for 22 years. How many of them were there? There were 10 of them. So that's why that's why the exile was supposed to be for 220 years, 10 years, 22 years Yaakov suffered, caused by 10 of his children. That's a total of 220 years in exile. So then, how did it get down to 210? So it says the Megala Amukos lefisha mesu b'chutz la'aretz kala asara, because all 10 died in Egypt. Nisma'atu yud shanim, so that took off a total of 10 years from the number. V'lanishtahu v'galus ki imredu shana, and that's why they were only in exile for 210 years.
But what about Reuven? Reuven didn't.
So how you get to 10? You're making an assumption that Reuven is the 10th. And based on that, you're asking your question. What your question should have been is, who's the 10th?
Okay, who's the 10th?
Okay, so that there's a disagreement as to who the 10th is. So there's 3 answers. The first say Reuven because he didn't do enough to protect Yosef. There are those who say that it's Yosef himself who is the 10th because he started this whole process. And the third, they say, is Hashem. Now clearly this approach that says that them dying in Chutz La'aretz took off 10 years would not be the approach that it was Hashem who was the 10th, so you'd have to take the approach of either Reuven or Yosef. But
So who
good
didn't
point.
die in Egypt? There are 12 brothers.
Well, Binyamin wasn't part of the sale, and either Reuven or Yosef was not held responsible.
But they all died.
The Talmud seems to suggest that it's Yosef who's the 10th. At least that's the way the simple reading is. That Yosef is the 10th, so it would be the 12 brothers minus Reuven and Binyamin. Okay? So, Mishim Hachi, Nigla B'sneh, that's why Hashem appears in the thorn bush, Lirmos Shetar Ma'galos Hoy B'shvil Asina, that the whole reason is because of the hatred. But now that the 210 years is complete, it's time for them to be redeemed. Which means that according to the Zera Shimshon, step 1, it's going to get a lot deeper than this, but according to step 1 is that the thorn bush represents the length of the exile, and he doesn't quite say it like this, but this is what you would say: as long as the thorn bush is burning, that's how long the sin of sinas chinam, of the sale of Yosef, carries on. And you would have thought that there should be 10 more years, which means that maybe Moshe, when he sees this, would have said, wait, if it's because of the sale of Yosef, then it's still not time yet. There's still 10 years. So for that, Hashem tells him, no, the time is now, and there would be some small mitigating factor, which he says is the fact that the brothers die early.
Why does a dying in Egypt take off 10 years?
So dying, where a person dies and how a person dies is part of an atonement. So now this is such a terrible sin that usually if a person dies in a difficult situation or with suffering and things like that, it creates a great level of atonement. If a person, let's say if it rains by the Levaya, or if there's a terrible storm, and because of that they don't get the proper honor that's deserved of them, that's an atonement. And sometimes they do other things to a person who's passed in order to bring an extra level of atonement. So all these things count. Now, usually it would count for a lot more than this, but because the sale of Yosef is such a terrible sin, they're dying where they didn't want to be, and then their bodies had to be taken to Eretz Yisrael, which is not quite the same level of Kedusha as dying within Eretz Yisrael. So that's considered some level of it.
So even Yaakov had that because he died.
That's right.
Did the 210 years start when Yaakov came down?
I like to say that it's at the birth of Miriam, of Yocheved, the birth of Yocheved, between the walls. When the 70th person is born.
Okay, so that was when.
Yeah,
Yaakov
that is. I just specific point.
Okay.
Why? The time that Yaakov spent in Mitzrayim was 17 years, right?
Right.
So where does this number 10 come from? The brothers were in Mitzrayim as long as...
Yaakov suffered for 22 years.
Right,
And there were 10 brothers who caused this suffering, deserving of 220 years of exile.
right,
The fact that the brothers did not get to go back to Israel,
right.
and instead died in Chutz La'aretz, was itself a minimal atonement.
Right.
And so that took off a little bit of the deserved exile and made it, instead of 220, made it 210. It was an independent factor. If they had all fallen down and scraped their knee, maybe that would have taken it down further. But
I'm asking why 10? They were in Egypt 17.
because there were 10 of them. There were 10 of them. Each one took off 1 point from... Remember, they together, all 10 of them, caused the 220 years.
Right.
So they're dying in Chutz La'aretz. Each one took off 1 year from their...
Anyone talk about the illusion of fire burning you up, but not really consuming you? You just are always burning because hatred sort of eats you up, but you don't die.
He's kind of going to mention a word about that, but that's kind of it. That's the thorn bush burning. And where he's going to go, I feel like I'm giving it away, but he's saying more that the thorn bush represents that even when the Jewish people will continue to survive, even though we are in a burning fire.
So they're saying that the Jewish people is the bush, and the burning is our constant being brutalized or whatever.
Right.
But I was thinking more of that baseless hatred eats you up inside, but you don't die, you just are always burning. It never ends, so it's like a curse.
That's a good explanation. That works. Okay, let's go to a whole new level. This is something which is not often taught. We'll still continuing. He says, I have a difficulty. There's another reason for the exile, which you can pile on to all the reasons, but this one, unless you've seen the Zera Shimshon, you have never heard before. The Kasav Alev Aryeh b'Shem Gali Razia. Shebishvil shehevi Yaakov Avinu lashon targum b'Torah. Yaakov Avinu failed in his guardianship of the Torah, and he allowed a word of Aramaic to slip into the Torah. As we find, when Yaakov and Lavan make this pact, Vayikro lo Lavan Yegar Sahadusa. And Lavan referred to this mound of stones as Yegar Sahadusa, the mound of testimony. That's not Hebrew. That's not Lashon Kodesh. That's Aramaic.
What about the name that Paro gave to
Moshe.
Tzafnas Paneach. Right.
Yes.
So that's the question. It seems like even that is still basic Hebrew. It's not because it's not Egyptian, right? Right. But although those who say that basically all the names with pays in it are all the Egyptians seem to have a lot of pays in their names. But Tzafnas Paneach is an interesting discussion on its own. But it's certainly not like this word, which is an Aramaic word.
Well,
Now,
you had other names like Pofar.
right. So those are Hebrew versions of that name.
Okay.
Right. So you can have transliterations. You can have, but as long as it's a Hebrew word, especially names. Names you can quote names of places because that's still the Hebrew word for that name. Right. So if someone's name is Baruch, then if they go to another country, let's say they go to Japan, they ask them what their name is still going to be Baruch, and now Baruch is a Japanese word, because that's how Japanese people in their language are going to be referring to him. So it's still, but here where you have this totally unnecessary insertion into the Torah, and how did it make it? Now we're going to talk about this as we go through this. Why is this such a big deal? And right now it shouldn't sound like a big deal, and we'll see why it really is. Okay, but Yaakov Karlo Galed, and immediately Yaakov says, no, it's not Yigar Sadusa, it's Galed, a mount of testimony, but he called it Galed. For Yaakov Garam Zen. Now why is this Yaakov's fault that Lavan used Aramaic words? She'amar la'achiv laktu avanim v'yikchu avanim v'yasu gal. He's the one who made this suggestion. He said, go collect some stones. They took stones and they made a mound. B'shvil zeh ba'u Yisrael b'galus Mitzrayim, and that's what caused the Egyptian exile. Right, anyone want to try to explain this?
Wow.
V'zeu. Now, before we get into the explanation, which he's going to tell us, he says v'zeu ma'shakasav. It says vayisu einayim. They raised their eyes. Vayiru, when they saw, this is the brothers. V'hinei archos Yishmaelim. There's a band of Yishmaelim ba mi Gilad.
As a result of Gilad.
Right. Hainu Gilad shekar Yaakov lema shekar Lavan Yigar Sadusa. That's the problem. The Yishmaelim came from Gilad. Anyone wonder why it's telling us where the Yishmaelim are coming from? And the answer is because the Torah is telling you right there what started this whole problem. Was that little pact that seems so innocent between Lavan and Yaakov, and Lavan was brilliant because even when he knew he lost, he knew there were still ways that he can drop little secret bombs that will explode later on amongst his grandchildren. And so he dropped in that Aramaic word which sat there like poison until it destroyed and brought the Jewish people down into exile. And now you'll understand why you say it, your Pesach Seder V'zehu, Arami Oved Avi. Arami? Why are you calling him Arami? He has a name. His name's Lavan. And we call him Lavan Haramai. Not Arami. But now you know, Arami Davka, that it's actually the Aramaic word by which Lavan dropped in the Jewish people. Davka, Dainu Lashon Arami, is that Aramaic word which we carried with us, and that remained and sat there and poisoned us for the next few hundred years. Now, we still haven't explained why an Aramaic word would do that. But
What does this Gilad relate to this, what you said?
Well, that's Gal'ed, that's what Yaakov
Gal'ed.
called it. So that place of Gal'ed, which was supposed to be Gal'ed, but because Lava inserted that word, Yigar Sadusa, that's the only Aramaic in the whole Torah, so that sat there and allowed destruction of the Jewish people in the future. And we still haven't explained why, so hold on. All right, but first, another proof from the Haggadah. Everyone says this, Vayered Mitzrayma, they went down to Egypt, Anus alpi hadibur, forced because of the word. It should have been command by God, or forced by Hashem, or against their will. I know adibur shel arami shehevi b'Torah. You're reading in the Haggadah that there was some infiltration of some improper word, which somehow caused the weakening within the sanctity of the Jewish people. Okay, so now we need to understand what's wrong with Aramaic. Now he's going to explain it.
Not only that, it's up to Hashem to decide what gets put into the Torah or not. So Hashem didn't have to put that.
Oh no, Hashem, the story is being told. That's what we'll see. When Lavan inserts that word into the Torah, it isn't just that he's not just saying something, but he's actually doing something spiritually to the family of Yaakov. And the Torah is telling us that because the Torah is trying to tell you why they're in exile later. So while on the outer level it looks like that they're just running away from Lavan, they come home, they live in peace, and then they go down into exile into Egypt. And so you might find other reasons why they go into exile: the hatred, the promise to Abraham, all these other things. The Torah is telling you, by telling you Yigar Sadusa, the Torah is telling you that actually there's a big problem, some major blemish that was caused to Yaakov's children through Lavan interacting with them on this spiritual level, and that's why the Torah, if you're not ready to know this, you can't know this, but it drops these little hints, such as the Ishmaelim came from Gilad or Galeed, so that you should know this is all being caused like this. And you should, and I'm sure you've wondered this. I'm sure you've asked this question every Pesach. Why do we start telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim from Lavan? In the Pesach Seder, we start from Aram, Yovid, Avi. We should not begin there. You want to start from Avram, start from Avram. You want to start from Parshas Vayeshev, and Yosef and the brothers were fighting, and all that. We don't even talk about the fighting during the Pesach Seder. Instead, we say, well, you see, we had a grandfather, Lavan, and he tried to kill us, and we managed to escape, and we went down to Egypt. What's the connection between one and the other? It sounds from the Haggadah that's actually the real story behind the exile.
Make the connection more.
Because Hebrew and Aramaic.
Well, because you have to be able to look deeper and find it, and that's what the Zera Shimshon is showing us, this deeper
It's
information.
actually two words, though, isn't it?
Yigar Sadusa, right? Yeah, because in Aramaic it is two words.
But then they're using Arami and they're using Dibur, the other hints in the Haggadah. The Chachamim are giving you the hints right there.
Right, yeah.
If you really want to spend the time to learn the Haggadah, it's like 3 layers down, 4 layers down, but it's there.
Yeah, you would
which is
see it, right?
crazy.
Once he shows it to us,
It's like
it's
on top.
obvious. Yeah.
So why the
You never think of it
Megillah
before.
was written in Aramaic anyway? So it's written in Hebrew. The Megillah.
Right.
So the why is Aramaic the same reason? Megillah that we're reading is not in Hebrew. It's in Aramaic.
You mean Megillah Esther?
No, Haggadah, I'm sorry. But, yeah. The Haggadah is
Well,
in
which parts of the Haggadah? Some parts are in Hebrew. This part is in Hebrew. Yeah, some parts are Aramaic.
Right.
But this part of the
Quotes
Psukim
from Sukkim.
is in Hebrew.
So why use Aramaic? I mean, it comes off like
Because that was like the English
Aramaic.
translation.
Well, we haven't seen yet what the problem with Aramaic is. That's where he's going to go
But
next.
Aramaic in the Haggadah is so that the commoners can understand.
Well,
It's like doing an art scroll in English.
Well, let's see what he says. Then we'll see there might be more behind that.
Well, because the whole Gemara, then you have to look at why it's in Aramaic.
Yeah. That's all. We're going deeper here. Okay.
Power of the written word.
V'hatam. So what's the reason? Lefi shaloshon targum hu meyuchad l'chitzonim. This is going to open up a whole world of information. It means like this. The world was created in Lashon Kodesh. The world was created, Hu Amar Vayehi, Hashem spoke, and it was. Bidvar Hashem Shamayim Na'asu, with the word of Hashem, heavens were made. And what we understand is not just Hashem said, let there be light, and light came into being. When Hashem said, let there be, when Hashem said light, that is the light. Hashem's saying of light is the light. Because those letters which became expressed, that combination of letters, an Aleph, a Vav, and a Resh, when they came out, they are what light actually is. We can't see the Aleph, the Vav, and the Resh of light. So to us, it comes out as just light. But Hashem's word is what creation is. But there's also another side to creation. Hashem also created, and this was what will happen to us when we ate of the tree of knowledge, we confused good and evil. Good and evil are mirrors of each other. they have to be in equal power in order for the world to continue. And the evil tries as much as possible to emulate, to copy, as much as it can, the side of good. But the way the holy books write it, it is like a monkey trying to copy a human being. In other words, same shape, same movements, but something really wrong about the humanness of it. And that's why the holy letter, what did Hashem use to create the world? Which letter?
Hey.
With the letter Hey. Behei baram, Behi baram. This world is created with the letter Hey. And what's the word for monkey? Kof, which is kind of like a hay, but unstable, right? That has a long leg, it can't stand on its own. So so in the same way that the other side tries to copy, and it's always off a little bit, the other side has a language. It has a language which is kind of like Hebrew, but is a corruption of Hebrew, and that's Aramaic. Arami is the corrupted version of Hebrew, and is the language used by the chitzonim, by the outsiders. And our job as part of the world, of fixing the world, is that we have to reintroduce, we have to fix the language of Aramaic. We have to correct it and bring it towards the Kedusha and allow it to be fixed. That's why when you read the Parsha every week, you're supposed to read it twice in Lashon Kodesh and then once in Aramaic with the Targum. Because by doing it twice in Lashon Kodesh and once in the Targum, we can elevate and take back the holiness from the language of the Targum, from the Aramaic, and bring it back to Kedusha.
Is that why we use Aramaic for the Kaddish?
Right, so that's part of why when we do the Kiddush Hashem, we do it in Aramaic, when we do those things, yeah.
Rabbi, maybe this issue of the evil try to copy the good thing, it's like to confuse us because he says, oh, it looks like the same, so we make it.
Right, absolutely. That's Esav pretending to be holy. And they do a really good job. Now, the one who represents this more than anyone, the greatest, let's call him shyster, in the history of the Tanakh, Lava. Because Esav, at least, looks right. He tries his best, but he's not even good at
He marries someone.
Lavan is. You see how indignant he is. He's chasing after them to kill them, to kill his own grandchildren, and Hashem comes to him in a dream and says, "You better not touch them." So what does he say the next day to Yaakov? How could you not let me kiss my grandchildren before you go? Those are the words in the Torah. It says, had I known you were leaving, it says in the Torah, I would have sent you away with music. He says, I would have sent you away. It's in the Torah. It's not a medrash. In the Torah, he says, I would have sent you away with music. How could you do this to me? What is wrong with it? That is the greatest example of the Ramai, of the trickster, of the evil side. We don't do it like this. You want me to marry the younger daughter before the older daughter? Listen, between me and you, you're like my own flesh. Whoa, I think I'm going to charge you 7 years of labor. Right. Let's make a deal. I want to pay you fair wages. So you see all the 2-3 spotted sheep over there. Those will be yours, and I'll take all the rest. And then he switched it 100 times. And the whole time, it's with I feel so bad. I feel like maybe I'm giving you too much. But you know what? You're my son-in-law. It's unbelievable. His insertion of his mindset into the Jewish people is represented by this insertion of the Aramaic word into the Torah. And so it's not just the Aramaic word. It's the Yigar Sahadusa, which by the way means mound of testimony. mound of testimony represents the honesty and the agreement and the pact, and there's a little bit of Lavan's version of what a mound of testimony looks like within our psyche, from our grandfather, Lavan, because of the fact that Yaakov allowed this interchange between their minds and made this deal with him, thereby causing this corruption. And this corruption causes the Ishmaelim to come from Galeed, from Gilad, and the struggle between the brothers, who Lavan did give a kiss to each one of his grandchildren. And that carries us through, and we struggle with it, and now we're still trying to fix it. And that's why the Talmud Bavli is written in Aramaic, because we're trying to lift ourselves up out of the confusion and try to resolve all the questions and all the difficulties, and try to come to a clarity in order, because every time there's a difficult Gemara, and you ask a question, and you give an answer, you come out with clarity, you don't just fix that situation and your question, you fix the whole world. You fix all the corruption of the confusion between good and evil in the world.
Avram had a similar style of language when he bought the Machpelah. It was the same style. Oh, what's money between us?
Right,
How about 400
Right,
silver?
there's all a setup for the real one coming.
Maybe
Yeah.
that's why the Haggadah starts in Aramaic, so we can fix it.
Very good. So maybe that's good. That's why the
But
Agada,
in
especially Helach Ma'anya, which is right at the beginning of the Seder, maybe it starts off in that Aramaic language. So very good. So because that's what, while we're in exile, that's the language that we're using. Very good. Okay. One of the other reasons why we don't say why we say Kaddish in Aramaic is because the Kaddish is only for us, not for the angels, and the angels don't speak Aramaic. Why don't angels speak Aramaic? In fact, when the Gemara says that the angels don't speak Aramaic, says the Gemara, but didn't Gabriel teach Yosef 70 languages? So right before he came before power, so how could they not? The Gemara says no, they speak any other language, just not Aramaic, because Aramaic is this corruption of reality. So now we're back to the question of, so how does this tie into the burning bush? I'm going to try to go quickly here through this. That's why I'm revealed in the sneh. Even if you give another reason, you've never heard this explanation either. It's just amazing how creative he is. Why were they redeemed? In the merit of Yosef. Yosef refused to speak Egyptian. And where does he get this? That Yosef refused to speak Egyptian. Look at the language the wife of Potiphar says. Hevi lanu ish ivri. You brought us this Hebraic man. Why does she call him this Hebraic man?
So like a combination between like Aramaic and Hebrew.
Well,
Hebraic.
Well, no, that's my chance. But Ivri is, no, Hebraic means of Hebrew. So he's the Ish Ivri because he kept talking Hebrew all the time. Otherwise, how does she even know where he's from? Saramashkim Amar, Shamitanu Nar Ivri, there was a young man in Ivri there. Shafilu Lushanenu Einamakir, says Rashi, he doesn't even know Egyptian. Yosef knew Egyptian. Yosef speaks 70 languages. Even if he didn't speak at that point, but Egyptian certainly in the house of Potiphar where he worked. And the answer is, and even though Gabriel teaches him 70 languages so he could speak to Paro, other than when he met Paro, Lo Diba refused to speak any other language. Or even if you want to say other times when he spoke to Paro, but certainly out of Paro's palace, he didn't speak any other language.
So who understood him?
He gestured his way through life.
And his son was also an interpreter for him.
Right? But the son was an interpreter. But the son might have spoken the other
But
language.
it even says that when he spoke to the brothers, they didn't know that he spoke Hebrew, because they spoke Hebrew among themselves.
No, he did. He spoke...
No, they didn't know it. So he must have been
Yeah,
speaking
the brothers
to them
didn't know
in
that.
Egyptian.
Yeah, so as we say, it could be in the palace that things were different. But he didn't know what their language they would speak because they spoke through an interpreter. So there's a question, and this is a funny question, there's a question as to whether they spoke loud through an interpreter or Yosef
Whispered in his ear.
whispered. In other words, they didn't get to even hear his voice. So, which would be a very interesting image, but it actually makes sense in the way that the ancients used to do it. Like, you don't deserve to hear my voice. So they would speak out loud, and then the interpreter would pretend to whisper the meaning of it, and then he would whisper back the meaning, and then the person, maybe, and then the person would respond with. Now you'll understand when Yosef reveals himself to his brothers. It says, "Ani Yosef." Kalman Yosef Dafka Am Yosef Enechem Roes, your eyes see Kipi Hamedaber Elechem Beloshen Kodesh, that it's me speaking to you in the holy tongue. Lechen Gantem La'avias Kol Kavodi, tell my father about all my honor. Umihartem V'oradatem Es Avihenu, you'll bring my father down. Kalomar Al Yitzta'er Me'agalus. Don't worry so much about this exile. Shigarim Hu Lahavi Shahavi Lashon Arami B'Torah, because Yaakov knew that he had made a mistake. As soon as Lavan spoke those words, Yigar Sahadusa, that's something which Yaakov carried with him. And tells him, Shechas v'shalom tiel Yisrael geula, you're worried that Aramaic word caused the Jewish people to be trapped amongst the other side and never be able to escape. Don't worry. Sharini takanti apagam, I've begun the process of fixing this. But mashalo shanisias lashoni, because I refused to change my language. Even though I was in Egypt, I was the minister and the king, or I kept refusing to speak their language whenever I could avoid it. So when we talk about the Jews not changing their names, their clothing, and their language, according to the Zera Shimshon, that's really what Yosef starts, is this refusal to give up on his language. And it's interesting because you have many cultures within the United States, subcultures, where many of them are having this problem that many of them are not learning English because they're so self-sufficient as a community that, and then it causes a problem to the children, and because they can survive, but the next generation is having a more difficult time. Just getting around with just Spanish. It makes it difficult for them to get jobs, and here Yosef is doing this on purpose. He's starting this trend where the Jews speak Lashon Kodesh. So he says, because of Yosef, I'm going to appear on the sneh. And I will redeem them. The children of Yaakov deserved exile, specifically because of Yaakov's action. Yosef tiken, Yosef fixed it. B'schus hanigal u'v'zeh b'nei Yaakov Yosef selek mosh perish Rashi. Kshem sheraisa asna oseh shlichusi ve'enenu uchal. You see that because the burning bush is doing what I want it to do, therefore, because it's my messenger, it doesn't get consumed. Kach telech b'shlichusi ve'encha nizak. So too you can go in my merit, in my messengership, and you won't be damaged. Afanu Nomar, so says the Zera Shimshon, I'd like to add, he was in a place filled with Tumah. Yosef was on fire. He was the burning bush in the fire. And he protected himself from being damaged. And the Egyptians tried to change his name to Tzafnas Paneach, but he refused and continued to refer to himself as Yosef. They tried to get him to speak Egyptian, and he refused to give that up. So Hashem appears in the burning bush in the same way that the Jewish people, as long as we remain the sneh, as long as we remain, even though we're burning in the fire, as long as we maintain our language, our clothing, and our names, that allows us to also continue to survive in exile without consumption. So again, once more, it is an incredible explanation. He's telling us that there's a whole underlying story underneath this whole layer of what we see as the outside, which has to do with what led to all this hatred and all this difficulty. And that was the effects of Lavan, which was transmitted through this interaction which he has with them, represented by the Torah's use of that Aramaic word, the only Aramaic words which appear in the Torah. Yosef fixes that. That's why it's such a big deal. Shloshinu es Shemam, Shloshinu es Lashonam. So usually we say the reason why those are important things is because those identify you and keep you separate from the peoples, but according to him, it's actually what they use to hold on to, the side of the good, through the Lashon Kodesh, and with that the Jewish people merited to be saved. Right? Thank you.